Cops slapped a black woman in court. Seconds later, she took the judge's seat. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the marble steps of the Jefferson County Courthouse when everything changed forever. Detective Raymond Foster would spend the rest of his life remembering this day, the day his arrogance destroyed everything he had built over 20 years, the day he learned that sometimes the person you think has no power might actually hold all of it. The day he slapped a woman he thought was nobody, and discovered she was the one person who could end his career with a single word. This is the story of how justice found its voice in the most unexpected way, how one moment of cruelty became the catalyst for sweeping change, and how a woman named Judge Sophia Mitchell reminded an entire police department that the title of this story would become their worst nightmare. Cops slapped a black woman in court. Seconds later, she took the judge's seat. Detective Foster had arrived at the courthouse early that morning, his chest puffed out with the confidence that comes from 2 decades of never facing consequences. He stood at the security checkpoint like a king surveying his kingdom, watching people shuffle through the metal detectors with barely concealed contempt. In his mind, there were 2 types of people in this world: those who enforce the law and those who needed to be controlled by it. He had long ago decided which category black people belonged to, and nothing in his 20 years on the force had changed that poisonous belief. His partner, Officer Dennis Burke, stood beside him, younger, but equally corrupted by the toxic culture of their precinct. They had done this routine 100 times before, intimidating anyone they deemed unworthy of respect, using their badges as shields against accountability. Today would be different, though neither of them knew it yet. Judge Sophia Mitchell approached, the courthouse wearing simple civilian clothes, a deliberate choice she made every Monday morning. She believed in experiencing her courthouse the way regular citizens did, walking through the same doors, passing through the same security, seeing what they saw. It helped her remember that justice wasn't just about what happened in her courtroom, but about every interaction from the moment someone stepped onto courthouse property. She carried a leather briefcase containing the files for today's cases, including a particularly troubling pattern of police misconduct complaints she had been quietly investigating for months. Her investigation had led her to one name that appeared, over and over again: Detective Raymond Foster. She had read every complaint, studied every dismissed case, analyzed every pattern of behavior. Today, she would finally have enough evidence to take action, though she never imagined the evidence would come from Foster himself, delivered in the most shocking way possible. As Judge Mitchell approached the security checkpoint, Foster's eyes locked onto her with the predatory focus of someone who had found their target for the day. He saw a black woman in regular clothes trying to enter his courthouse, and his mind immediately categorized her as someone who didn't belong. He stepped forward, blocking her path with his considerable bulk, his hand already moving to his baton. The security guards at the checkpoint looked away, having learned long ago not to interfere when Foster was in one of his moods. Burke pulled out his phone, already anticipating the entertainment that was about to unfold. Neither of them noticed the security cameras recording every angle, the automatic backup systems capturing every word, or the fact that several courthouse employees had stopped to watch with growing recognition and horror. "Where do you think you're going?" Foster's voice dripped with the kind of disdain that comes from years of unchecked prejudice. He didn't wait for an answer before continuing his assault. "This is a courthouse, not a welfare office. Whatever sob story you're here to peddle, whatever criminal boyfriend you're trying to visit, you can turn around right now." Judge Mitchell remained calm, her years of judicial training having taught her the value of composure in the face of hostility. She reached for her identification, moving slowly and deliberately to avoid any excuse for escalation. But Foster wasn't interested in identification. He had already decided who she was and what she deserved. His hand shot out with the speed of someone who had done this many times before, the slap connecting with her face with a crack that echoed through the courthouse entrance. The force of it sent her stumbling backward, her briefcase falling open. and scattering legal documents across the floor. The sound of that slap would haunt everyone who heard it for years to come. It wasn't just the physical violence of it, though that was shocking enough. It was the casual nature of it, the way Foster did it without hesitation or concern, as if slapping a black woman at the courthouse entrance was just another part of his morning routine. Burke laughed and zoomed in with his phone camera, already thinking about the jokes he would share with the other officers later. Foster grabbed Judge Mitchell by the arm, his fingers digging into her skin hard enough to leave bruises that would last for weeks. "I asked you a question," he snarled, pulling her close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath. "But I guess your kind never learned proper respect. Maybe a few hours in holding will teach you some manners." Judge Mitchell looked Foster directly in the eyes, memorizing every detail of his face, every line of cruelty etched into his features. She didn't resist when he spun her around and pulled her arms behind her back. She didn't protest when the handcuffs clicked shut, even though they were applied too tightly, cutting into her wrists. She simply said, very quietly, "Officer, I'm Judge Sophia Mitchell. I preside over Courtroom 7 in this building. If you would check my identification, you would see that I am scheduled to begin proceedings in 30 minutes. Foster laughed, a harsh sound that drew chuckles from Burke and several other officers who had gathered to watch. "Sure you are, and I'm the President of the United States. You people always think you can lie your way out of trouble. Well, not in my courthouse." The irony of him calling it his courthouse while assaulting the woman who actually presided over it would later become the subject of countless legal discussions. But in that moment, all anyone could see was a powerful man destroying a woman he thought was powerless. Foster dragged Judge Mitchell through the courthouse halls, making sure everyone saw her in handcuffs, establishing his dominance for all to witness. Court clerks who had worked with Judge Mitchell for years stood frozen in shock, unable to process what they were seeing. Laura Chen, Judge Mitchell's personal clerk who had served her faithfully for 8 years, felt her hands shaking as she watched her mentor being paraded like a common criminal. She wanted to scream, to tell everyone who this woman really was, but fear kept her silent. The same fear that had kept everyone silent about Foster's behavior for 20 years. They brought Judge Mitchell to Courtroom 7, her own courtroom, though Foster didn't know it. The nameplate outside reading, "The Honorable Judge Sophia Mitchell," somehow escaped his notice, his arrogance blinding him to details that should have been obvious. Inside, a different judge, Judge Harold Brennan, was temporarily presiding over the morning docket. He was an older man, set in his ways, who had always been friendly with the police department. When Foster strutted in with Judge Mitchell in handcuffs, Brennan didn't recognize her immediately. She was out of her robes, her hair disheveled from the assault, a red mark blazing across her cheek where Foster had struck her. To Brennan, she was just another defendant, another case to process before lunch. "Your Honor," Foster began, his voice taking on the practiced tone of someone who had testified hundreds of times before. "We have a situation here with an individual who attempted to breach courthouse security. When confronted, she became belligerent and physically aggressive. She claimed to be a judge, obviously a lie intended to avoid arrest. We're recommending charges of trespassing, resisting arrest, and impersonating a government official." Brennan nodded along, already filling out paperwork. This was routine for him. Another example of citizens not respecting authority. Another case of someone trying to game the system. He didn't question Foster's version of events. He never did. The thin blue line had always been thick in his courtroom, and he saw no reason to change that now. Judge Mitchell sat quietly in the defendant's chair, her hands still cuffed behind her back. She studied the courtroom she had presided over for 12 years, noting how different it looked from this angle. She had sent hundreds of people to prison from the bench that Brennan now occupied. She had delivered justice, shown mercy, and changed lives from that position of power. Now she sat where the accused sat, feeling the weight of the system pressing down on her. It was a perspective she would never forget, one that would influence every decision she made for the rest of her career. She thought about all the defendants who had sat in this chair before her, wondering how many of them had been telling the truth when officers like Foster lied about their actions. "Does the defendant have anything to say?" Brennan asked, his tone suggesting he expected nothing of value. This was the moment Judge Mitchell had been waiting for. She stood slowly, her dignity intact despite the handcuffs and the bruise forming on her face. When she spoke, her voice carried the same authority she used when delivering verdicts, the same power that had made attorneys tremble and defendants hope for mercy. "Your Honor, I am Judge Sophia Mitchell. I have presided over this courtroom for 12 years. My identification is in my briefcase, which Officer Foster knocked from my hands when he assaulted me without provocation at the courthouse entrance. I request that you verify my identity before proceeding with these false charges." The courtroom fell silent. Brennan's face went pale as recognition finally dawned. He had seen Judge Mitchell hundreds of times, had sat through judicial conferences with her, had even had lunch with her just last week. But the context had blinded him. The narrative Foster had created overriding what his own eyes should have told him. His hands began to shake as he realized the magnitude of what was happening. Foster, however, remained oblivious to the change in atmosphere. He scoffed loudly, playing to what he thought was a supportive audience. "Your Honor, she's clearly delusional. This is exactly the kind of behavior we see from people trying to avoid responsibility. Next, she'll claim to be the governor." Laura Chen couldn't stay silent any longer. She stood up from her seat in the gallery, her voice cracking with emotion but clear enough for everyone to hear. "That is Judge Mitchell. I'm her clerk. I've worked for her for 8 years. Officer Foster assaulted a sitting judge." The words hung in the air like an explosion waiting to detonate. Other courthouse employees began to stand, each one confirming what Chen had said. The court reporter, who had transcribed thousands of Judge Mitchell's decisions, nodded vigorously. The bailiff, who had provided security for her courtroom for 5 years, looked like he might be sick. One by one, the truth spread through the room like wildfire, each confirmation another nail in Foster's professional coffin. Foster's partner, Burke, had stopped recording, his phone hanging limply in his hand as the reality of their situation crashed over him like a tsunami. They hadn't just assaulted a random woman. They had assaulted a federal judge in her own courthouse in front of dozens of witnesses and security cameras. The magnitude of their mistake was almost incomprehensible. Foster's face went through a series of transformations, from confusion to disbelief to absolute terror as the truth finally penetrated his thick skull of prejudice. His legs began to shake and he had to grab the prosecutor's table to keep from falling. The same hands that had struck Judge Mitchell with such casual cruelty now trembled with the realization of what he had done. Judge Brennan immediately ordered the handcuffs removed and began apologizing profusely. But Judge Mitchell raised her hand to stop him. "Judge Brennan, I appreciate your concern, but I believe it would be inappropriate for you to continue presiding over this matter. There are clear conflicts of interest, and justice must not only be done, but be seen to be done. I will be taking over this courtroom immediately." Brennan practically ran from the bench, his robes billowing behind him as he fled the scene of his shameful complicity. Judge Mitchell walked slowly to her chambers, each step measured and deliberate despite the pain in her wrists and face. Inside her private office, she took a moment to compose herself, to transform from victim back to judge. When she emerged 5 minutes later wearing her judicial robes, the courtroom gasped collectively. The transformation was complete and devastating. This wasn't just any judge that Foster had assaulted. This was Judge Sophia Mitchell, known throughout the legal community for her unwavering commitment to justice and her particular focus on police accountability. She had written landmark decisions on civil rights, had testified before Congress about police reform, had been featured in legal journals for her innovative approaches to criminal justice. And Foster had slapped her like she was nothing, like she was less than human, like her life and dignity meant nothing at all. The poetry of justice was about to be written in the most devastating way possible. Judge Mitchell took her seat on the bench, her rightful place, and looked down at Foster, who now stood where she had stood just minutes before. The reversal was so complete, so perfect, that several people in the gallery later said it felt like watching a movie, like something too poetic to be real. But it was real, documented by security cameras, witnessed by dozens of people, recorded in the court transcript that would become one of the most widely read legal documents in American history. "Detective Foster," she began, her voice calm but carrying an undertone of steel that made everyone in the courtroom lean forward. "You have been with the police force for 20 years. In that time, you have been the subject of 113 complaints. Would you like to know how I know that number so precisely?" Foster couldn't speak. His throat had closed up completely, his voice stolen by the same fear he had instilled in so many others over the years. Judge Mitchell continued, pulling out a thick folder that had been waiting in her chambers for weeks. "For the past 6 months, I have been conducting a judicial review of systemic police misconduct in this jurisdiction. Your name, Detective Foster, appears more frequently than any other officer in the department. Excessive force, racial profiling, false arrest, tampering with evidence, perjury. The list goes on for pages." She opened the folder and began reading from it, each complaint another brick in the wall she was building around Foster's future. January 2019, Marcus Johnson, a teacher, filed a complaint stating you arrested him for looking suspicious while he was walking to his car after school. The case was dismissed, but Mr. Johnson spent a night in jail and lost his job. February 2019, Maria Santos, a nurse, reported that you slapped her during a traffic stop when she asked for your badge number. The complaint was marked as unsubstantiated. March 2019, David Kim, a lawyer, alleged you planted evidence during a search of his vehicle. Internal Affairs declined to investigate. The list went on and on, each name a person whose life Foster had damaged or destroyed, each complaint a cry for justice that had been ignored until now. "But, Detective Foster," Judge Mitchell said, setting down the folder, "none of those complaints included video evidence. None of them had the kind of irrefutable proof that would make it impossible for the system to protect you. Until today." She gestured to the court clerk who pulled up the security footage on the courtroom's display screens. The entire assault, played out in high definition from multiple angles. There was Foster blocking her path. There was his hand striking her face. There was him dragging her through the courthouse in handcuffs while Burke laughed and filmed. The evidence was so clear, so damning, that several police officers in the gallery got up and left, knowing their association with Foster was about to become toxic. "This video," Judge Mitchell continued, "shows you committing assault, battery, false imprisonment, and civil rights violations under color of law. These are federal crimes, Detective Foster. But more than that, this video shows who you really are. It shows the contempt you have for the people you swore to protect and serve. It shows the racism that has poisoned your entire career. It shows the arrogance that made you believe you could do anything to anyone without consequences." Foster finally found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Your Honor, I didn't know who you were. If I had known—" But Judge Mitchell cut him off with a raised hand. "If you had known, you would have treated me with respect? Is that what you're saying, Detective Foster? That whether someone deserves to be treated with basic human dignity depends on their job title? That assault is acceptable as long as the victim isn't someone important?" Her voice rose slightly, the first sign of the anger she had been controlling, since the moment Foster struck her. "Every person you've ever mistreated deserved the same respect you would have shown me if you had known who I was. Every single one of them was a human being with rights, with dignity, with value. The only difference between them and me is that I have the power to ensure you face consequences for your actions." She stood up from the bench, walking to the front. of it to address not just Foster, but everyone in the courtroom. This is not just about what happened to me today. This is about a system that has allowed men like Detective Foster to operate with impunity for decades. This is about a culture that says some people deserve justice and others don't. This is about the countless victims who were silenced, ignored, or blamed for their own victimization. Today, that changes. Today, Detective Foster, you will face the kind of justice you've denied to so many others. The courtroom was absolutely silent as Judge Mitchell returned to her seat. She picked up her gavel, the weight of it familiar in her hand, the symbol of the authority Foster had tried to strip from her. Detective Raymond Foster, based on the evidence presented, witnessed by dozens of people, and recorded on multiple cameras, I find probable cause for the following charges: assault in the first degree, a felony punishable by up to 25 years in prison, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, a federal crime punishable by up to 10 years in prison, false, imprisonment, a felony punishable by up to 5 years in prison, and perjury for the false testimony you gave to Judge Brennan about the circumstances of my arrest. Foster's legs finally gave out completely, and he collapsed into the defendant's chair. His partner Burke was already being placed in handcuffs by federal marshals who had been called to the courthouse. The same handcuffs they had used on Judge Mitchell were now being used on them, the poetry of justice writing itself in real time. Furthermore, Judge Mitchell continued, I am ordering an immediate federal investigation into every arrest you've made, every case you've testified in, and every complaint that was dismissed without proper investigation. The victims you've silenced deserve to have their voices heard. The people you've wrongfully convicted deserve to have their cases reviewed. The community you've terrorized deserves to feel safe again. She raised the gavel high, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Everyone in the courtroom knew they were witnessing history, a moment that would be studied in law schools, discussed in police academies, and remembered as the day the system finally worked the way it was supposed to. Detective Foster, you told me this morning that this was your courthouse. You were wrong. This courthouse belongs to justice, and justice has no tolerance for those who abuse their power. You're about to learn what accountability feels like. The gavel came down with a sound that echoed through the building and into history. The aftermath of that morning spread like ripples across a pond, each wave bringing more consequences for Foster and more justice for his victims. Within hours, the video of the assault had been released to the media, and by evening, it was the lead story on every major news network. The image of Foster slapping Judge Mitchell became a symbol of police brutality, shared millions of times across social media with the hashtag #WalkJusticeForJudgeMitchell. But Judge Mitchell herself redirected the attention, insisting that the focus should be on Foster's other victims, the ones who didn't have her power or platform. She used every interview, every public appearance to highlight their stories and demand justice for them. The federal investigation she ordered uncovered a pattern of corruption that went far beyond Foster himself. His superior officers had covered for him, prosecutors had ignored evidence of his misconduct, and other judges had consistently ruled in his favor despite clear violations of constitutional rights. Within 6 months, 17 officers had been arrested, 3 prosecutors had been disbarred, and 2 judges had resigned in disgrace. The entire police department was placed under federal oversight, with new policies implemented to prevent future abuse. Body cameras became mandatory and couldn't be turned off. Complaints were now investigated by an independent civilian review board. Officers with multiple complaints faced automatic suspension pending investigation. Foster himself was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 35 years in federal prison. During his sentencing, Judge Mitchell recused herself, ensuring that justice was not only done, but seen to be done without any hint of personal vengeance. The judge who did sentence him read letters from 47 of Foster's victims. each one describing how his actions had affected their lives. Marcus Johnson, the teacher Foster had arrested for looking suspicious, spoke about losing his job and struggling to find new employment with an arrest record. Maria Santos, the nurse Foster had slapped during a traffic stop, described the PTSD she still suffered from the encounter. David Kim, the lawyer Foster had tried to frame, talked about how the experience had made him dedicate his career to defending others against police misconduct. Foster's former partner, Dennis Burke, cooperated with federal investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony revealed a culture of racism and violence within the department that had been hidden for decades. He described how senior officers had taught him to target black and brown citizens, how to write reports that would justify excessive force, and how to ensure that complaints would be dismissed. His revelations led to a complete restructuring of the department's training program, with new emphasis on de-escalation, cultural sensitivity, and constitutional rights. Every officer in the department had to undergo retraining or face termination. Judge Mitchell established a foundation for victims of police misconduct, using the speaking fees and book deals she was offered to fund legal representation for those who couldn't afford it. She worked with law schools to create clinics specifically focused on civil rights cases, training a new generation of lawyers to fight against systemic injustice. Her foundation also provided counseling services for victims of police brutality, understanding that the trauma extended far beyond the physical injuries. Within 2 years, the foundation had helped over 300 people seek justice for police misconduct, many of them cases that had been dismissed or ignored for years. The courthouse where it all happened became a symbol of transformation. A plaque was installed at the entrance with a quote from Judge Mitchell's speech that day. "Justice does not depend on who you are, but on what is right. Every person who enters this courthouse deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their race, their economic status, or their position in society." Tour groups came to see Courtroom 7, where justice had triumphed over injustice. Law students studied the case as a masterclass in judicial courage and the importance of accountability. Police academies used the video as a teaching tool for what not to do, though Judge Mitchell insisted they also teach about the systemic issues that had allowed Foster to operate for so long. Years later, when Judge Mitchell retired after a distinguished career that included appointment to the Federal Appeals Court, she reflected on that morning in an interview. "People often focus on the dramatic reversal, the poetry of me taking the bench after being assaulted," she said. "But what matters more is what came after. One moment of accountability isn't enough if the system that created the problem remains unchanged. Real justice requires sustained effort, systemic reform, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths about power and prejudice in our society." She paused, then added something that would become one of her most quoted statements. "Detective Foster thought he was slapping just another black woman that morning. He didn't realize he was slapping awake a justice system that had been sleeping for far too long." The title of this story, "Cops Slapped a Black Woman in Court." Seconds later, she took the judge's seat, became more than just a description of events. It became a rallying cry for justice, a reminder that power can be held accountable, and a warning to those who would abuse their authority. Foster's name became synonymous with police brutality and the consequences of unchecked power. Judge Mitchell's name became synonymous with courage, dignity, and the unflinching pursuit of justice. The contrast between them, captured in that single moment when she took her rightful place on the bench, continues to inspire those who fight against injustice and remind those in power that their actions have consequences. Today, the impact of that morning continues to ripple outward. Police departments across the country have implemented policies based on the reforms that followed Foster's arrest. Civil rights organizations use the case as a blueprint for holding law enforcement accountable. Judge Mitchell's foundation has expanded nationally, helping thousands of victims of police misconduct seek justice. And in law schools across the country, students study the case of Foster v. Mitchell not just as a legal precedent, but as a moral lesson about the responsibility that comes with power and the importance of standing up to injustice, no matter who you are or where it comes from. The security cameras that recorded Foster's assault are now part of the permanent archive at the National Civil Rights Museum, a testament to how quickly justice can turn when truth is finally revealed. The handcuffs Foster used on Judge Mitchell are displayed in a case next to them, along with a photo of her on the bench that day, robes flowing, gavel raised, delivering justice to the man who thought he was above it. Visitors often stand before the display in silence, contemplating how many other Judge Mitchells might be out there, people with power and dignity who are treated as less than human because of the color of their skin. Detective Raymond Foster now spends his days in a federal prison cell, a small concrete room that he will call home for the next 3 decades. He has plenty of time to think about that morning, about the moment he let his prejudice and arrogance lead him to strike a federal judge. He thinks about all the people he hurt over the years, all the lives he destroyed, all the pain he caused. Sometimes, late at night, he can still hear the sound of that slap echoing in his mind, followed by the sound of Judge Mitchell's gavel coming down, sealing his fate. He knows now what his victims knew all along, that justice may be delayed, but when it finally arrives, it strikes with the force of truth that cannot be denied. The story ends where it began, with a reminder of its powerful title. Cops slapped. A black woman in court. Seconds later, she took the judge's seat. But this is not really an ending. It's a beginning, a moment when the system finally worked the way it was supposed to, when justice prevailed over prejudice, when truth triumphed over lies. It's a reminder that every person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, that badges and uniforms don't grant the right to abuse others, and that sometimes the person you think has no power might be the very person who holds your fate in their hands. It's a story that continues to be written every day in courtrooms across the country, where judges like Sophia Mitchell preside with wisdom and courage, ensuring that justice is not just a word, but a reality for everyone who seeks it. The morning. Sun still paints golden streaks across the marble steps of the Jefferson County Courthouse, but now those steps mean something different. They are no longer just an entrance to a building, but a threshold to justice, a place where anyone, regardless of their race or status, can walk with dignity and expect to be treated with respect. The security officers who work there now have been trained to see every person who enters as deserving of courtesy and protection. They know the story of what happened that morning, and they know that their job is to protect and serve everyone, not to judge or discriminate. The courthouse has become what it was always supposed to be, a temple of justice where the only thing that matters is the truth. And somewhere, in courtrooms across the country, other Judge Mitchells preside with the knowledge that their courage has inspired a movement, that their dignity has shown others what is possible, and that their commitment to justice has made the system a little bit better, a little bit fairer, a little bit more just. They carry with them the lesson of that morning, that justice doesn't just happen. It must be fought for, protected, and sometimes taken back from those who would deny it to others. They know that every time they put on their robes and pick up their gavels, they carry the responsibility to ensure that what happened to Judge Mitchell never happens again, and that what happened to Detective Foster happens to everyone who abuses their power. This is the legacy of that morning. The true power of the story, titled "Cops Slapped a Black Woman in Court." Seconds later, she took the judge's seat. It's not just about one woman's triumph over one man's cruelty. It's about a system being forced to confront its failures, a community finding its voice, and justice finally being served. It's about the hundreds of victims who finally got their day in court, the thousands of people who were inspired to fight against injustice, and the millions who learned that sometimes, just sometimes, the system works the way it's supposed to. And it all started with a slap that echoed through history, followed by the sound of a gavel that announced to the world that justice had finally arrived.